You're listening to A Second Look on the Orca. A second look is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on past events, unpack their significance, and discuss their long-term implications. A second look is intended to give thoughtful reflection on issues that made the headlines and elicited strong responses as a society. What did we think then? What do we think now? What have we learned? And now, your host, Justin Goodrich.
Welcome to another edition of A Second Look here on the Orca.ca. I'm your host, Justin Goodrich. On this edition of A Second Look, I'm joined by Dr. Tim Cooper. A retired professor, Dr. Cooper now spends his days touring across the country speaking about climate change. Together, we'll be taking a second look at the evolution of climate change, how it became part of our everyday societal discourse, its impacts, the steps being taken to mitigate its risks, and ultimately, what each of us can do to combat this imminent threat. Welcome to the program, Tim.
Thank you, Justin. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tim, today, the term climate change is part of our everyday societal discourse. However, that wasn't always the case. Tell our listeners, when did climate change start to become an issue of concern for scientists? And furthermore, when did it subsequently become an issue that our society really truly became familiar with?
Well, I don't think there was any definite 1 year where the transition occurred. It's been a slow process. The phenomenon became known to scientists a long time ago, back in the early 1800s, when it was realized that carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere was causing the Earth to be 32 degrees Celsius warmer than it would have otherwise been, which actually is a good thing because we'd be an ice ball without it. It was noticed way back in the late 1800s that carbon dioxide is building up due to the consumption, burning rather, of coal. And there was a Swedish gentleman called Sven Arrhenius in, 125 years ago, did the definitive calculation to say, if we double the amount of carbon dioxide in the air, it'll raise the globe's temperature 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. That calculation still stands today. Modern day calculations don't show any big variation from that. And that's just a statement that the laws of physics haven't changed over time. In fact, as far as we can tell, they've been pretty consistent for the last 13.7 billion years. So that was when science became aware of it. But when did it become a concern? It wasn't much of a concern in Arrhenius's days. First of all, he liked the idea of the Earth warming because he was Swedish. Secondly, really, the rate at which carbon dioxide was being emitted by the industrialized countries really wasn't much. But the whole globe has really grown in its economy and grown in its fossil fuel consumption. So it was around the middle of the last century, I suppose, people began to look at it, mostly scientists, to say, it's a little bit iffy. In my case, my physics teacher, towards the end of what would be called grade 12 physics in Canada, actually called A-level physics in England, came in on the last class and looked at the class and said, "Class, I apologize." We all looked at each other and said, "What's he done? What horrible thing has he done?" And he went on to say, "My generation has given your generation two problems. We should never have left you with this: the risk of nuclear war and the greenhouse effect, which is what we now call climate change or global warming." So it was known back in 1975 it was going to be a problem. And my physics teacher was perfect in his timing, because from that point on, the temperature has gone up massively and much more rapidly than it had in the past. So within science, I would say 1970s, 1980s, big concern by about the year 2000. And the issue of climate change in the general society came later, though, obviously quite a bit later. It was when we first started to see the effects, which again was around 1980, 1990, something like that. People really started to notice, hey, it's changing. This is real, which is silly because the laws of physics have always been real, but somehow you just have to nudge people with something they can see and they can feel before it becomes real to them. So It's become a major concern here in the valley. I'm calling from Chilliwack, a city that was cut off from the rest of the world just a few days ago by a massive downpour, which I'm sure your listeners are familiar with, because your listeners are presumably mostly in Vancouver area. And now everybody's talking about it. So it has become a concern for almost everybody. There are still parts of our society that deny it's happening. I had an invitation to debate on Zoom a gentleman in Chilliwack who's a climate change denier on the local TV station. That was just this morning. And he had to cancel because his house was flooded. I tried not to smile. But there are still groups out there that do not believe in climate change. Even political parties in Canada refuse to pass motions to acknowledge its reality. And I suspect, as a former political scientist, Justin, you know which one I'm talking about. So does that give you the feel for the answer that I have?
It certainly does. I'd like to go a little bit deeper though then, because even when it first started becoming part of our societal discourse, there wasn't any by and large, there wasn't any urgency attached to it. We heard about this thing, and we heard that it may not be really great for us, but it seemed to take quite a bit of time to evolve into something that people were starting to engage with as an idea. And as a result, it only seems to be in recent years where there is this sense of have. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that urgency that's developed over the past decade or two, that have caused us, across the globe to ensure that we are taking action and being proactive.
Well, I think that sense of urgency was definitely there in the scientific community, but there was a block between the scientific community and the general public, that information getting out. Excuse me, that block was a deliberate ploy on the part of many corporations. Exxon was perhaps the one that did the most, but also the Koch brothers, who have a massive empire of coal mines and coal-fired power stations. They spread a tremendous amount of disinformation. A whole bunch of stories such as, oh, don't worry about it, it's getting warmer, but that's just the sun getting warmer, was one of the common themes, but there are many other themes out there. So the general public was stuck. One group of scientists, as they saw it, was saying global warming is something we have to worry about. And another group of scientists, or actors dressed up in lab coats, whichever you prefer, are saying it's nothing to worry about, it's natural. But I think in the last few years, the effects of climate change have become sufficiently extreme that people are starting to realize. I think that's really the folding of the opposition to climate science from the industry has produced the big spike in people thinking, oh, it's real. So I even heard a politician from the Valley on the radio this morning who's been poo-pooing climate change all of his career. Suddenly, after this deluge, he actually said, we have to do something about this. And I never thought I'd hear that. But it's really deliberate slowing down, followed by a final crumbling of the opposition.
Well, certainly crisis tends to get most people to look at things and think of things differently. I'm wondering, given the picture you just painted, though, and the amount of disinformation that has taken place, do you believe there is something we could have done differently? Could we have been more proactive, or was it a situation of we didn't know what we didn't know, ergo we're in this situation now and we better get our butts in gear?
But within the scientific community, it was always that way. We knew we had to move. We had to move fast. There was a huge frustration, though, because scientists are reasonably good communicators when they're talking to other scientists or talking to students, but when they're in a political debate, they're not trained for it. I am a scientist. I was going up against a climate change denier today, supposed to be, and I would have lost, most likely, because I'm not a skilled debater. I'm just a scientist. So the other side, the denier side, if I can call it that, had tremendous advantages. We just recently had a Committee of the Whole, number 26, big meeting in Glasgow. Different countries sent different delegations. The biggest delegation of them all in Glasgow was 503 delegates from the fossil fuel industry, bigger than any country. And when you have that number and they are skilled at lobbying, their voices are the ones that get heard. So we're still not quite there in terms of our accepting the real sense of urgency that this requires. And I'm not sure how to increase people's understanding of the sense of urgency. Certainly the heat dome and now the flooding in BC help. They speak louder than I certainly could, or any scientist.
To your point then, Tim, I wonder as a society if there are things that we could be doing differently in terms of from a proactive lens through, say, education or even some basic regulation. I wonder what can be. In some ways it's a little too late, but we're still in that sweet spot, I'm told, as I understand it, where we can try and change things. But it seems to me it needs to be two-pronged. One, address the current issue, and two, essentially ensure it doesn't happen again through, again, education or otherwise. What are your thoughts on sort of that immediate piece and the longer, let's make sure we never get here again piece?
Well, the immediate piece is basically trying to rebuild our infrastructure so that it can withstand the effect. But the long-term piece is a little different. And your question suggests what could we do now and what could we have done several years ago? And I think I have an answer for that.
Please.
If we compare Canada to compatible countries, say European countries, Germany, France, Britain, Canadians emit 3 times as much carbon dioxide per person as your average European. And when you look, that's despite the fact that our electricity comes from hydro, and the generation of our electricity does not give carbon dioxide. Whereas in Europe, they still have natural gas and coal that they use to generate electricity. So how do they do it? How do they have a life with so little emissions, and yet it's a compatible lifestyle? And the answer is quite simple. They have more expensive gasoline, more expensive coal, more expensive natural gas. If something is expensive, people will find ways to not use it. So, so Europeans use 1/3 as much carbon, or emit 1/3 as much carbon dioxide into the air as we do, but they pay $2.22 a litre on average at the pump, whereas we're paying a very cheap $1.50 at the pump. That doesn't sound like a huge difference, but you look at what it costs to fill up a pickup truck, and you say, how many Europeans have pickup trucks? How many North Americans have pickup trucks, especially Canadians? And suddenly it all becomes very clear. In my home, if I'm heating with electricity, BC Hydro has a system where I go to step 2 and I end up paying more than the cost of the electricity as a way of conserving. But my natural gas is subsidized by the government. So it's cheaper to heat my home with gas than electricity. And gas, of course, when you burn it, gives off carbon dioxide. Electricity here in Canada does not. So the action that's needed in the future is just to put a price on carbon. Very simple, not difficult at all. How much price on carbon is the next question. If you put too low a price on carbon, nothing happens. So here we have a federal tax of $40 a ton. And the Conservatives who've criticized that have also brought it in to say, that's not going to do anything. It's doing nothing. And the worst thing about that type of lie is that it is the absolute truth. The worst type of lie, because it's deceiving. It makes it sound like a carbon tax is not the way to go. It's failed. But that's because the carbon tax is way too low. If you want to raise our, say, gasoline prices to the level of Europe's, we would need a tax of about $300 a ton. We're currently looking at 40. So the carbon tax it's the right-wing solution. It's what all the right-wing economists would say, because don't interfere in the marketplace, don't have the government picking winners and losers. Just, we don't know what we want people to do. Take the bus, bicycle, buy an electric car. We really don't know what we want them to do, and we don't care. But we know what we don't want them to do, which is to burn carbon and form carbon dioxide. So you tax carbon rather than subsidize electric cars or subsidize other different forms of energy use. So had we started that years ago, it would have really helped. You may wonder how Canada stacks up against the rest of the world. And of the top 10 emitters on the planet, top 10 emitting countries, we are number one on our per capita emissions. So we're not good. We are the problem worldwide. That's despite the fact that China, with 2.5 times less emissions per person than we do, seems to manufacture all our goods while running their electricity on coal. So yes, we are number one. Canada can therefore make a huge difference. Being number one, it's a bit embarrassing, but on the other hand, we have the biggest opportunity to cut our emissions. So that should have been done in the past, and also that should be done in the future. It's very common for fossil fuel industries to point the finger at anybody else but them. And that's human nature. You expect that. It happens all the time. But in reality, you can't solve this problem by planting trees. You can't point your finger at cows with their burps. Yes, there are effects going on, but those are tiny compared to the fossil fuel emissions. For example, if we planted trees all over the planet where we're not using that land for agriculture, then when those trees start absorbing carbon dioxide at the maximum rate, they'll be absorbing 1/11 of the emissions of carbon dioxide that our fossil fuel industry puts out, the global fossil fuel industry puts out in this case. So tree planting and trees, moreover, they catch fire or they die and the carbon comes straight back out anyway. So yes, there's good reasons for planting trees, but reducing carbon dioxide is not one of them. And the methane that comes from cows, that carbon was in the biosphere anyway. It was in the grass. They just put it into the air in a different chemical form, methane, which does trap more heat, and then eventually it oxidizes to carbon dioxide, and we're back into the grass. So the big issue is the removing of carbon from the ground into the air. That's the big issue. And the carbon tax is the only way I've seen that actually seems to work. So that's a rather long answer, a bit long-winded.
No, it's why you're the perfect guest. You're extraordinarily knowledgeable, and I think it's important for listeners to be able to simply listen to you uninterrupted as you very methodically walk them through this. Given the state that we're at now, it does seem to be, as a layperson, it seems to me that we are on the edge of either we will be able to get back on track or we're screwed, frankly. And I'd like you, please, to tell my listeners very plainly what some of the threats are we are facing in the next couple of decades if we don't get this under control. And perhaps, if you can, both the Canadian lens and then sort of the global lens, because I'm shocked in terms of what I just heard about where Canada rates. That's extraordinarily disconcerting. So if you could paint a picture for our listeners, and I think, I mean, let's be honest, we're having this conversation a week after the devastating flooding in British Columbia. So some of it is obvious, but walk our listeners through a bit of a timeline the next decade or two.
Well, not too much is going to happen. Forgive me if I change your question slightly, because when we put a slug of carbon dioxide into the air, say a ton of carbon dioxide, then that carbon dioxide will stay in the air for quite some time. Half of it will still be there in 2,000 years' time. So we could say, although not technically correctly, it has a half-life of 2,000 years. So whatever we do now is going to affect the climate for the next 2,000 years. That's an awful lot of generations. That's like 100 generations, if I've done my math correctly. So it's not the next 20 years we're really concerned about. However, that was your specific question. So let me go back to that, is that we've seen, it's just here in British Columbia, that, may I assume, Justin, that most of your audience are in BC? And I can speak BC?
Yes, please. Yes,
okay,
that's,
sure, okay.
That's accurate.
Yeah, okay. Then what we've seen in BC over the last 10 years is the appearance of forest fires. I've lived here in Chilliwack for almost 30 years, and forest fires were very rare, and we hardly ever got smoke in the valley from them. It did happen. Now it's starting to happen every second year, and that change has happened in just 10 years. So over the next 20 years, we're going to see more and more forest fires and more smoke because the temperature is going up and up and up. We're also going to see in the wintertime more downpours, such as the one we've just seen. There's a relationship between temperature of the air and the amount of water vapor in the air. For your listeners that might be into physics or chemistry, it's actually called the Clausius Clapper Unrelation. And it says, if you warm the air and you warm the water, then the amount of water vapor goes into the air is exponentially increasing with temperature. So a 1 degree temperature change, such as we've seen globally, has caused a certain increase. If we have a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, the water vapor won't be going up by the same amount. It'll be going up by 2, 3, or even 4 times that amount. So we're going to see the amount of water vapor in the air, and that means the intensity of storms and rainfalls go up significantly during that time. The dangers to us is more of a engineering or geography or civil planning sort of thing than me. I'm a physicist, so I could just say that it's going to be a lot more water coming down a lot faster in the future. And we can all imagine the effects. So I have to stick within my expertise a bit on that one. But we have seen quite a demonstration as to how fragile our infrastructure is. However, that, to my way of thinking, that pales into insignificance compared to another issue that we'll start to see over the next 20 years, which is food supply. When it gets really hot outside, we all run inside and turn on the air conditioning. We hardly notice it. We don't feel it in our bones, but our crops are left out there. And here in the valley, our summers are going to get hotter and drier. Agricultural production will be going down significantly. A lot of our food comes from Southern California. Southern California is already suffering because they're warmer to begin with, and the water supply that their farmers have traditionally used to irrigate the crops in California came from melting glaciers in the mountains. Well, those glaciers have all but melted right off now because of the increase in temperature. So agriculture is finding it very difficult to get enough water. And plants themselves don't do well in this much heat either. So the big effect you're going to see in the next 20 years is food prices. Well, food go into a shortage, but as a rich country, we might not notice there's a shortage on, but we will notice it reflected in the price of food. So I think the biggest effect that we're going to have is a big increase in the price of food and more dramatic weather. Okay, I'll stop at this point.
No, cool, boy. So you talked a few minutes ago about essentially taxation. I'm wondering, though, outside of what government could do, which would obviously be a mechanism of the government, what about your average citizen? I mean, it will, and I'll use myself as an example. I think I do relatively okay. You know, I have my Keurig coffee maker, but I take the thing out to recycle it as opposed to throwing it in the trash. I've been using more, dish rags instead of paper towels. Living here in Vancouver, I have the benefit of being able to walk a lot more. So I generally only drive if I really have to, like a major grocery shop, or ironically, I love the outdoors. So I take my Jeep into the outdoors. I can see the irony just saying that out loud. But, by the same token, this is not my area of expertise, Tim. And so help me, and presumably some of my listeners, understand some of the things we can do to mitigate and perhaps play our very small role in trying to reverse the effects of climate change.
Okay, certainly. Yes, I give presentations to any group pretty much that invites me, and I always finish up with a list of things that we can do. Number one is how you vote. Okay. Climate is determined by politicians. That sounds weird, but it is exactly true. The European politicians are responsible for their countries emitting a third as much carbon dioxide as our politicians. So bearing that in mind, voting is number one. within Canada itself, and this figure is getting a bit old now, from about 10 years ago, but 15% of the emissions in the country come from people heating their homes and driving their vehicles. The other 85% is essentially from industry. So yes, I'm going to answer your question, Justin, I really will, but we're talking about the 15%. Your vote will change government policy, which will then affect industry. For example, if industry decides they want to make aluminium without any carbon dioxide emissions, but it's just a touch more expensive, a carbon tax would tip it over. Industry will then start to move. So if you, as an industry, you own a very large building, should you insulate it, which costs money, or should you just burn a bit more natural gas and live with the heat loss? Well, if the gas is cheap, you're just going to burn the gas. If the gas gets expensive, hello, you've just created a lot of jobs for insulators to come around. So in terms of the government, that's the 85%, that's what you could do. But now I promise I will come to your question. What can you do as an individual? Well, it's tricky, but there are some things you can do. The best one of all, next time you're thinking of buying a new vehicle, would be to go with an electric vehicle. Yes, even better if you can do as you do in Vancouver, just walk or take the bus. But if you're stuck out here in Chilliwack, sometimes the distances get a bit too large for walking and the buses come every hour, if we're lucky. So an electric car is actually a good start. The nice thing about an electric car is that you don't even know you're driving an electric car. Once you're inside, it functions just like an ordinary gasoline car. It accelerates much faster, which is way more fun to drive, but otherwise it's the same. In the storms in Chilliwack, we had a problem that our gas supplies were cut off, our gas stations went out, and a whole bunch of us offered to give people rides all through the city because the electricity was not cut off, the gas was. But I digress. Coming back to electric cars, how do you convince people to drive an electric car? Human beings don't naturally do what's good for society as a whole. They tend to do what's good for themselves. That's just the way we've evolved. But here's the thing. If you go and buy an electric car, it costs a little bit more upfront compared to a gasoline car that's compatible. However, your electricity cost to run it, if you use your home electricity, is only 1/7 as much as the gasoline cost if you had a gas car. So I do a little calculation involving a Chevy Bolt and a Toyota Corolla. The Corolla cost $25,000, the Chevy Bolt $42,000. But guess what? Over the life of those vehicles, assuming they both live to about 300,000 kilometers, then you're going to spend $27,000 on gas and $4,000 on oil changes for the Toyota, which you won't spend at all on your electric car. You'll spend 1/7 of that $27,000, a very small amount. And at the end of the day, the electric car is going to come in about $5,000 cheaper overall on its overall life. That's even without the government rebates. So yeah, next time you're thinking of making a purchase, go buy yourself a good electric Jeep. They're coming. And that's one thing you can certainly do. The other thing you can do, now in your case, Justin, I'm assuming, if my memory is correct, that you're living in a multi-story apartment building or condominium.
Yeah, that's correct.
So you don't really have to worry. Your heating cost and the amount of energy that goes into heating, your little part of it is very, very small. So don't worry about that. But in the case of people who live in a standalone house, then the heating costs get to be significant. So it's worthwhile looking at how you could heat it. Obviously, insulation is a great way of doing it. And if you can just hire a contractor to put insulation in, do so. However, before you do it, there's actually some government programs. You can have an inspector come over, charge you about $800, tell you what needs to be done. And then if you do it, you can get your $800 back. It's a government program funded, supported by the taxpayers. So there's a lot of things you can do in a house to reduce its carbon footprint by almost a factor of 2 without too much problem. Mostly replacing windows, insulation, locating drafts and sealing them, etc. But the big thing you can do is to say, okay, I'm not going to heat with gas anymore. Just as the electric car revolution has dramatically changed the technology and the economics of travel, so the heat pump revolution has changed heating. My house has a prehistoric heat pump. It's 11 years old. 11 doesn't sound that old, but actually it is in terms of technological change. My heat pump starts to fail when the temperature gets down below 5 degrees Celsius. The new ones start to fail at -25 Celsius. So yeah, I don't need gas put into my house. I can heat the whole house with a heat pump, and that'll end up actually cheaper slightly than using natural gas. So, hey, we don't need oil for transportation. We don't need gas for heating. And we don't need coal for generating electricity, because a third revolution just happened. But this is not something the individual would do. The third revolution is that solar and wind energy are now cheaper than coal energy or gas energy for generating electricity. It's crazy to just keep burning fossil fuels. We could save a lot of money if we got rid of them. So at home, that's the two biggies. Insulate your house, switch to a heat pump, and drive electric.
Okay. Well, I mean, certainly food for thought. I don't know that I'll ever own a standalone home in Vancouver, of all places. So I mean that that eliminates a couple of those ideas, but the electric car. I've known you many years now, Tim. I think we go back to 2008 or 9 or 10, somewhere in there. So there's over a decade now, and you've been on me about these electric cars for years, and slowly but surely you're winning me over to the notion of it. I do want to. You've touched on something else, and we didn't discuss it before the show, but I hope you'll indulge me for just a minute or two before we conclude. You talked about the role of politics in addressing the issue of climate change. As a resource-based country like Canada, and with our neighbors just next to us in Alberta, with the oil sands and whatnot, and recognizing the amount of jobs that it creates and what it does for our economy, how do you circle that square between progress and moving forward without, and maybe it's not even possible, you'll tell me in a moment, but presumably without it having major economic impacts and forcing people from jobs that they've been doing 10, 20, 30 years. How do you circle that square, Tim? Can you?
There's a lot of oil workers belong to an organization, I think it's called Iron and Earth, that are lobbying the government to really essentially get rid of the fossil fuel industry, retrain those workers to work in the clean energy business. There are already in Canada more jobs in clean energy than there are in oil, coal, and gas combined. The propaganda machine doesn't let you know that. You have to go digging to find those numbers. And I don't have them right in front of me, unfortunately, but it's pretty impressive. There's something like 2% of Canada's population are directly and indirectly associated with the fossil fuel business. And the ones that are directly associated with it is way below 1%, more like 0.3, 0.4. So yes, there are jobs out there. Alberta, ironically enough, has the most unregulated energy sector, electricity sector in particular. And here in BC, we have BC Hydro with more of a stranglehold on what we're trying to do here. And they make the decisions. In Alberta, however, it's more free enterprise. I'm a big fan of free enterprise. And as a result, the private company has said, we're going to build a solar power plant in southeastern Alberta. It's going to be 0.5 gigawatt when it's finished, which is, that's half the size of a big coal-fired power plant, but it's a start. So there's a lot of jobs there building that solar plant, and they're going ahead, employing people. They're going to be generating electricity far cheaper than the coal plants can. So all of a sudden you have cheap electricity flooding into the grid in Alberta. What does that mean for every other business? That means the business is losing one of its expenses. That makes them more internationally competitive. So there's lots of things you can do with renewable energy that you could not do with fossil fuels. But why is fossil fuels still going, you may ask? Well, in Canada, we have a government, federal and of course provincial ones. In total, they subsidize the fossil fuel industry using taxpayers' dollars. to the tune of quite a large amount of money. How large depends on which study you're looking at and which one you choose to believe and not. I'm a physicist, I'm not an economist, so I go to an institution that I see has no reason to exaggerate. That's the International Monetary Fund. They've done a study on all the different countries in the world and how much we subsidize fossil fuels. In Canada, they reckon it's 40 billion US dollars per year subsidy to the fossil fuel industry. That's huge. That works out to be about 1,650 Canadian dollars per person per year for every man, woman, and child. So where does all this money go? Well, it's going to the industry. Where's the industry? Alberta and Saskatchewan. So Canada has turned into a country that has massive flows of wealth into Alberta and Saskatchewan in the form of subsidies. And if that subsidy stops, which would be a good thing, I think, because I'm a great big believer in free enterprise, then we're going to see a massive drop in carbon dioxide emissions and a big gain in employment. So when you wipe out one industry, the new industries which are producing the same product but cheaper are going to benefit the rest of us. The figures vary greatly. You'll see some people saying it's only 10 billion, not 40 billion. And that's because it depends on what you mean by a subsidy. Let me give you an example. Here in Chilliwack, 20 people die every year, on average, from breathing air that's been contaminated by burning fossil fuels. 20 people in Chilliwack every year. Where did that number came from? It came from me. I just did a scaling of the Canadian number for the Chilliwack population compared to Canada. In Canada, our physicians report that it's about 7,000 people a year die every year from breathing polluted air, from motor vehicle exhaust primarily, coal-fired power plants in a few places. There's a cost associated with that, all those dead people. Not to mention, as a rule of thumb, if one person is killed by this air pollution, there's probably 3 or 4 that are very seriously injured, and therefore they have to be looked after, they can't work. So when you put all of the accounting in, which the International Monetary Fund does, our fossil fuels are costing us a fortune. So yes, to give you a long-winded answer to a short question, eliminating fossil fuels would eliminate the jobs. But the same is true if you eliminate the job of, for example, assassin. If you make killing people illegal, you put a whole bunch of assassins out of business. But that doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. Now, it's a bit of a cool comparison, perhaps, but I hope it illustrates the point. If a person is doing good for society, you should put government money there. If they're harming society, you should not put government there.
It's certainly an intense analogy. Tim, I so enjoy our time together, especially when we get to do this over a beer or two. It's always a good conversation. By way of a final question for you, then, Tim, help our listeners just understand what's next. What is next for this province and this country if we don't make those necessary changes and don't pull punches?
Well, we're going to see. There's a cartoon did the rounds of the internet, and it was Bart Simpson and Homer Simpson talking. And Bart was suffering in the heat of the summer. He said, "Oh no, this is the hottest summer of the rest of my life." And Homer Simpson said, "No, Bart, don't think of it that way. This is the coolest summer of the rest of your life." So with that in mind, it looked funny on the t-shirt. With that in mind, what we're seeing is just the beginning of the visible effects of climate change. So we're just going to get more of the same. We're going to get hotter summers, colder winters, more expensive food. It's just going to continue. I think I've already said this and I'm repeating myself, but I'm not quite sure how else to handle your question.
No, well, then let me ask it perhaps a different way. Is it too late, Tim? Is it too late?
Too late for what? Now, we can Okay, I think, that was rhetorical. So you're struggling to, I can see you're struggling to answer that one. That's a rhetorical question. There's nothing we can do about the warming we've caused so far. In fact, the carbon dioxide's gone in the air, it's trapping heat. If we stopped emitting carbon dioxide tomorrow, that would be quite disruptive, although I would push the button to stop it if I could, because the carbon dioxide that's already up there is still trapping heat. Earth has not attained what we call thermal equilibrium. So it's like we've turned on a heater and we've stopped turning up the heater, but the heater is still heating the house. And so the temperature of the house is going up. So we'd see continuing increase in temperature for the next 50, 100 years, something like that, based on the carbon dioxide we have already put up there. So we're going to see, no matter what we do, more of the same. If we want to prevent it from becoming absolutely horrendous, however, for the benefit of our grandchildren, then we really need to drop down those emissions. So whatever we do, we're going to see it getting worse before it gets better. And if we keep emitting, we're not going to see, no generation is going to see it getting better.
We can do something about it, and we can do it for the sake of future generations.
And it doesn't cost anything. That's the big thing that people don't quite understand. The clean energy is now cheaper than dirty energy. Let's stop subsidizing dirty energy. So
all right.
That's the key.
Well, on that note, thank you, Tim, so very much for joining me today. Always a delight to listen to you speak. That does bring us to the end of this month's edition of A Second Look. I'd like to thank my guest, Dr. Tim Cooper, for joining me. If you have questions or comments about today's program, or if you would like to get a hold of Dr. Cooper to invite him to come and make a presentation to your organization, feel free to email us right here at asecondlook@theorca.ca. We'll make sure your email gets to Dr. Cooper. Again, asecondlook@theorca.ca. Until next time, I'm Justin Goodrich. Thanks for listening.
The preceding program was brought to you by Alliance Public Affairs Group in association with Van Grio. If you have any questions or comments about today's episode, please email us at asecondlook@theorca.ca. Thank you for listening, and please remember to like and share.